Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody who is available to join us, and interested in today's fascinating online conversation titled Systemic Rivalry, Strategic Competition and the International Order, Russia, China, and the West. I'm Christian Forstner with the Hanns-Seidel-Foundation, and it's my pleasure to partner with you, Dr. Sokol, with the American Council in Germany, and of course to introduce our main speaker featuring today, Professor Gerlinde Groitl. Professor Groitl is a professor, associate professor at the University of Regensburg, but with a couple of also international and national teaching assignments, including Passau, London, Washington, D.C., and coming up soon, Freiburg. Professor Groitl has, and I have it here in my hands, presented and authored a fascinating book on strategic competition, Russia, China, and the Revisionist Assault on the Western Liberal International Order. So to everyone who is interested in today's turbulent world, I highly recommend this book, which is available on Amazon. So this is, Professor Groitl offers unique insights into contemporary developments in Russia and China. She brings together these developments with today's international developments, and offers also scientific introduction and presents new concepts of realism, from constructive realism to destructive realism. So it's a fascinating read. So it is again a pleasure to partner with you, Dr. Sokol, with the American Council in Germany. It's not our first joint event. It's definitely not our, I hope so, not our last one, but I'm very confident, it's one of our best ones, Professor Groitl is an outstanding scholar and researcher, and a fascinating presenter on issues, which really come to the heart of today's international politics. Having said this, again, it's my pleasure, Christian Forstner, Hanns-Seidel-Foundation, to welcome you all. I hand it over to you, Dr. Sokol, for the next, and you're gonna guide us through the next maximum 1 hour. Thank you.
Lieber Christian, herzlichen Dank. Many thanks. It is always great to partner with you and your partners at the Hanns-Seidel-Stiftung. So thank you again for this opportunity. And although I've known Gerlinde Groitl for a while, this idea of having this webinar actually came up over coffee a little over a year ago in Munich, on almost a spring-like day. We were sitting outside just before the Munich Security Conference started, and Gerlinde was talking about this book that she was putting the finishing touches on, and which was going to come out in the fall of 2023. And so I'm absolutely delighted that we're able to have this conversation today, particularly at a time when we are seeing a turbulent global environment. And so I'd like to almost start our conversation by asking you, Gerlinde, to share with us how we got here. But before I pose the question, let me tee it up a little bit, because I think that many of our viewers and many people in general, when they think back to the early 1990s, maybe the euphoria of the end of the Cold War was waning, but there was certainly a sense that liberal democracies had triumphed over authoritarian regimes, and that we would be looking at a period of peace and prosperity. And here we are now in the early 2020s, some 30 years later, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, concerns over China's possible invasion of Taiwan, growing rivalry between China and the United States are all stark reminders of the fact that we live in an era of renewed great power competition, and that the post-Cold War international order is not one that can be taken for granted. And so this vision, this hope of peace and prosperity that so many people had, does not reflect the reality of today. Some people would even say that the international order today is in shambles. So Gerlinde, I'd love to just sort of start by asking you to share with us this trajectory, this path. How did we get here? And then we can look at some of the underlying issues a little bit more closely.
First of all, thank you so much for having me, Steve and Christian. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thank you so much for the generous introduction. You put the bar really high, so I hope I can live up to it in our conversation this afternoon. So by alluding to the early 1990s and the hopes that we've had, and by now it's almost a classic to refer to Francis Fukuyama's End of History and how naive that may have been. I'd like to start out by saying that back in the days of the early 1990s, things really did look pretty hopeful. All the numbers were indicating that democracy is on the march. If you track the development of democracy in the world, we were really at a height in the 1990s. Ever more countries were transitioning to democracy and embracing market economy and embracing liberty and freedom. So it was not totally outlandish to hope that this was really the way the world would be going. But still, I would say that even in the 1990s, you could see early warnings on the wall that countries like Russia, like China and others, they would not embrace liberal democracy easily. In the case of Russia, you saw a return back to authoritarianism and small baby steps maybe in the 1990s, but still you could see it already under the reign of Boris Yeltsin, that the country was not, despite all proclaimed wishes and despite all the political rhetoric, that the country was not moving west. And in the Chinese case, it was even more evident because the Chinese in 1989 decided to crack down on the democracy movement. We had the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Communist Party of China did everything, even in the 1990s, to prevent the country from liberalizing politically. So while there was understandable hope that things would indeed be moving in this positive direction, there were also clear indicators that this is not what's going to happen. And so my answer to your first opening question would really be, this is a long-term development that we are now end up in a pretty dark and unhappy place of almost political despair, I would say, because we look around in the world and things are going in the wrong direction, it seems, on every front, be it with Russia, be it with China, be it with the Middle East. The list can go on and on. But the indicators that those two major countries, Russia and China, were not embracing a Western, US-led liberal international order, they were really present already in the 1990s. And we should have been more aware of those warning signs, and we should have taken precautions way more early. Maybe we could have prevented some of the things that are happening right now. But both countries were already on a difficult path, let's put it that way, beginning in the 1990s. And they moved to a real policy of revisionism in the late 2000s. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about what has changed in those two countries that really made them go revisionist full scale.
So before we do that, I would like to maybe pick up on one of the threads that you just mentioned. We should have been more aware of the warning signs that we saw earlier on. I guess one question that I have for you is why do you think that some of those developments were not taken as seriously as they could have been or should have been? Did people really just want to, focus on the glass half full and the positives? Did leaders have their head in the sand and were sort of ignoring some of these developments? Why do you think we didn't take those warning signs more seriously when we could have maybe done something?
Yeah, I guess the answer is really that all of the above sort of played a role. But when we look at China, for example, in the 1990s, it was very clear that the country was turning towards the free market, or let's say a freer market economic policy, because it never embraced free market capitalism, since it is even now a state capitalist country. But there has always been a clear attempt to undercut any pressure of political reforms. So what China, for example, did was they would work in the United Nations and another international fora seeking to prevent pressure from the United States and other countries on them, political pressure. They tried votes diplomacy in the United Nations to avoid condemnation or even punishment for human rights violations. There was a lot of, you could call this make-believe about reform intent. That was actually initiatives undertaken to prevent reforms from happening. So you would see institutes to study human rights that emerged, but they were actually party-led. And so they really didn't have the idea of promoting human rights in China, but rather pushing away pressure from the Western world by saying, oh, see, we're on a reform path, things are changing. So you have, on the one hand, policy decisions made in Beijing that try to protect China from political liberalization demands. And these played well with observers and politicians in Western countries who really honestly hoped for the best. Because wouldn't it all be nice if we could just get along together, do trade, investment, business, and somehow work together cooperatively? So from the Western side, you would see all sorts of initiatives like human rights dialogues, other political dialogue formats, hoping to get closer and get on the same page when it comes to political differences, to negotiate them out in political processes. And the Chinese were accepting these kinds of formats. So you could make the case that, yeah, it was not without reason to believe that these initiatives for dialogue and reform, that they were working out in the long run. But then again, on part of the Western countries, I think there was a lot of, now I would call it naivete, but maybe also hubris. Because when you look at the documents, when you look at speeches, there was always the clear sentiment that dictatorship will really run out of business. Because in this modern interconnected world with a lot of communication and information that is floating freely in the world, dictatorship will not be able to hold. So there was the firm belief that the pressures are just so high that democratization would somehow be inevitable. But of course, that's wrong if the political leadership in a country works really hard to prevent that from happening. And then there is the last element that I would add to the answer. There were business interests, forceful, powerful business interests. So even once people realized that things would not go as planned, they did not have good policy options on the table. And institutionalizing political change is really a hard thing. We see it even in the 2010s, where it was very obvious that China was not opening up anymore, where it was very obvious that Russia was turning into an aggressive regional power, seeking to, crack down on its neighbors by force, as it has done with Ukraine since 2014. But even then, political change did not come naturally, because there were, one, business interests, and B, a lack of obvious good political alternatives. Because the real alternative, sort of a neo-containment policy, and we might talk about this later on, is just really costly, and it's not very attractive, because it would mean to acknowledge that we are back at square one, sort of where we started with the end of the Cold War.
So I'd definitely like to come back to the concept of a neo-containment policy and what that might look like and what measures might need to be taken to introduce that. But before we do that, in your comments just now, you talked a little bit more about China than you did about Russia. And I think in our conversation, we'll sort of toggle back and forth between the two, because while there are some similarities, they obviously have differences that need to be taken into consideration. But I actually was talking with somebody over dinner over the weekend, and he was saying that it's sort of understandable that Putin is behaving the way that he did, and was reflecting a little bit, maybe we in the West made a mistake when thinking about EU expansion and particularly NATO expansion, because we were coming up on Russia's borders, and given Russia's geography, also concerns about China to its east, that there were pressures. I didn't disagree. I didn't agree. I mean, my feeling is very much that we in the West and in Europe should have been thinking about expansion of NATO and of the European Union to include some of those countries of Central and Eastern Europe that were suddenly able to join the European Union. But as you reflect on some of the mistakes that were made and think about some of the the hubris, but also the naivete that might have been felt in Brussels, do you think there are things that we could have done differently that might have led to less tension with Moscow?
So as an academic, I always try to be very nuanced. But in this case, I want to really give an unequivocal answer. No, EU enlargement and NATO enlargement are not to blame. I feel really strongly about this because it's a recurring narrative that has been very prominent on this side of the Atlantic, particularly in Germany, before the full-scale invasion, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was sort of the go-to explanation of why things have turned out badly with Russia. From my analytical sense, there's just no point to it. And I'd like to explain why I think so. So these two enlargement processes, and it may be a little tiny aspect, but I prefer to speak about enlargement instead of expansion, because I think it just transports that this was really an enlargement process undertaken by sovereign nation states using their free will to decide their own course of action. Expansion always has this ring of NATO and EU, I don't know, sort of conquering other countries and incorporating them to become bigger and bigger. And this is really not what's happened. So these two enlargement processes, they helped make Europe more stable, more prosperous, more democratic, more free, more at peace with itself than anything else I could have imagined. Because the vision that Russia had entertained, even in the 1990s, was essentially a continuation of a divided Europe. And this sort of vision that was very clearly antithetical to everything that was in the Charter of Paris from November 1990. The Charter of Paris, which sort of ended the Cold War, was signed by Moscow and said that Europe's future would be one of a united, a free, a democratic, economically liberal Europe, where each country has the free will and the ability to decide for itself. But already in the 1990s, Russia sort of walked back from this commitment. All the talk about a near abroad, when Moscow, even in Yeltsin's days, spoke about the post-Soviet environment, the post-Soviet states, this already indicated that the idea in Moscow was really to have an exclusive sphere of influence where it and it alone would decide what sovereign countries really could or could not do. And there was no way for the West to embrace this vision of a post-Cold War Europe, because it would have been a divided Europe once again. So I'm really very clear here that these enlargement processes supported democracy, freedom, stability in Europe. Because just imagine if all these new members of those institutions had been left outside without an opportunity to join, what would Europe look like today? I cannot really, with all my fantasy at play, I cannot imagine that Europe would look any better than it does now. And this Russian vision of an exclusive sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, it's just one that you could not embrace from a Western standpoint if you were really hoping to overcome Cold War divisions.
So I think that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about why both Russia and China have turned revisionist. I mean, I think it's fair to say, from everything that you've said and everything that we know, that both countries, both China and Russia, both Beijing and Moscow, were not happy with the way in which the post-Cold War international order was unfolding and did not see the kinds of opportunities that benefited their national interests. And I think that that's true in the 1990s, but then certainly in the early aughts, the early 2000s. So I having studied this, I'd love to hear from you why each of these powers turned revisionist, and how that manifested itself.
So I'd like to start out with just a couple of words on security. What do countries want to be secure? And the general idea is that it's all about territorial integrity. So as long as your borders are intact, countries don't have to worry about their security. But the argument I unfold in my book is that security is really much more holistic. Because what countries want is, of course, inviolate borders, but they also want security of their own regime. They need an international environment that works for their own economic system to have prosperity and economic security. They have an idea of themselves, though every country has a sort of mindset that it brings to international affairs. I call this ontological security, so the idea of yourself as a country that leaders want to protect. And every country has a normative bargain about how the government relates to the people, to the individual in society. Now, when you look at these individual elements, you will see that this liberal international order that the US and its partners built and tried to enlarge, even globalize in a post-Cold War setting, it was really antithetical to many of the security needs that Russia and China defined for themselves. So in a world that was promoting democracy and rule of law, countries that are essentially autocratic or even dictatorships, they are under constant pressure to adapt their own political system. So their regime security is constantly threatened if the norms of the international system consider democracy and rule of law as the standard and dictatorship as the aberration from the rule. They both have political systems where the individual is not at the center of attention. It's the strong state that takes decisions, and citizens are subject to the state. They are not, the sovereignty doesn't lie with the people, it lies really with the strong state. Again, if you have policies that support the vision of universal human rights defined as individual political rights, they feel constantly threatened by the norms and institutions that this order holds. And in an ontological sense, so in terms of their self-understanding, both countries see themselves as rule makers, not as rule takers. Both countries see themselves as powers, great powers with a legitimate prerogative beyond their own borders, with a right to adjust borders, because they don't believe that the borders as they exist now are really legitimate, but they are considered as an accident of history. So both have really great concerns and view the international order that has been promoted by the West as deeply unjust and necessary to be revised, because they cannot thrive as the imperial great powers, authoritarian great powers that they are. Which is really why both had an intent to change the international order as it was emerging in the post-Cold War era from the beginning. But only in the late 2000s, and I'll close with that, had they the chance to really try to adjust the international order because of the changing balance of power, because of the US weakening itself over the course of the war against terrorism, the financial and economic crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So they both had an intent to revise the international order because it was not conformant with how they saw themselves and how their political regimes worked domestically.
But let's continue to talk about this a little bit, because I think in this process, as Beijing and Moscow were sort of dealing with global developments, I think one could argue there was an attempt to sort of accommodate and respond to these developments. In China's case, I think there was more of a sense of how can we be strategic, how can we position ourselves. In the Russian case, and I think that this plays out in the now decade-old conflict in Ukraine too, there was a sense of resentment and really a pushback against the West through conflict. But given that Russia, despite the war in Ukraine, really should be seen as a declining power, and China is struggling as well and is not the global power that it once was and that many perceived it would continue to be, particularly when you then also think about demographic trends on the horizon and a shrinking population in China as well. Can you talk a little bit more about this revisionism and repositioning more recently, and then where that puts us today in terms of great power conflict? I mean, obviously, we're seeing this play out in Ukraine, but we're seeing it play out in other parts of the world as well. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the developments of the last couple of years, but then also where that puts us today.
So you already alluded to some of the terms that I used in the book. China pursued a policy of strategic accommodation in the 1990s and early 2000s, and Russia accommodated resentfully because they couldn't change anything about the emerging status quo. Now, in the late 2000s onwards, they moved towards a policy of what I call in the Chinese case, constructive revisionism, not in a normative sense. I don't think it's good, constructive in the sense of goods, but constructive in the sense of aspiring to build a novel Sinocentric world order, whereas Russia resorted to what I call destructive revisionism. And the differences in their just the availability of resources, of power capabilities that both countries have, explains why they resort to different strategic options. So China has obviously made a tremendous development to become the second largest global economic power. The projections into the future, I totally agree with what you mentioned. I do not see China's rise continue as it has been in the past because of all the domestic difficulties that they have. But still, up to this point, China has emerged to a sizable economic power and can wield this very economic influence, its financial influence, to shape global developments, to win partners with investment promises, or by giving out loans, by just fostering investment across the globe. The Russian case is really different because the portfolio of power resources that Russia has at its disposal is much more narrow than the one China has. So China has money to invest in all formats of power, including military power. The Russian case, you have, yes, military power and the decisiveness that an authoritarian regime offers. But other than that, Russia cannot use its economic power because it's simply not an economic power of note besides its resource sales of natural resources. So what Russia utilizes in its destructive revisionism is really military force, blackmailing, the use of its nuclear arsenal as a bargaining chip, as a tool of political coercion, which is an interesting development that is really a dangerous development when nuclear force is not considered a deterrent of last resort, but rather a bargaining chip to be used in order to coerce others to do your will. And Russia is very much invested in disinformation campaigns and just practices of undermining Western democracies within. Now, this is not the toolbox that you need to build a novel world order. Mm-hmm. This is really the toolbox that you can use to spoil and undermine an existing one. And it's, as Russia is a declining power, I would really support that assessment. It is a declining power going down violently in crude, ruthless, brutal battles as we see it right now in Ukraine.
So, and you've talked a little bit about this, in terms of what both Russia and China sort of hope to achieve. But I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more about whether they have the same goals and objectives, and how likely you might see an alliance between these two countries. Seems to me that there are obviously some shared goals that they have, but not that each of them has a worldview that's identical with the other. There are definitely some distinctions between the two. But can you talk about where there's overlap and where some of those differences are?
Absolutely. So I think the overlap is really, it can be condensed to one thing. They are united in enmity to the United States and the Western world order at large. And you can see this in the way they think about the United States, the way they talk about the United States. They both consider the United States to be their biggest foreign policy problem, and they interpret their own difficulties in their regions alike. So from the Russian point of view, all its neighboring countries should fall in line almost naturally and orient themselves toward Moscow. That's the mentality that Russian leaders bring to the table. But it's the United States that is allegedly meddling in those countries, turning them around and make them, look west and orient themselves towards the west instead of gravitating towards Moscow. The Chinese see it in a very similar way. So they interpret their Taiwan problem as one where the United States is artificially keeping the country divided and makes or incentivize Taiwanese moves towards independence and tries to create problems for Beijing just single-handedly. Same with China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. For them, it's really the United States that is artificially tilting the balance of power in the region and keeps China from taking what is legitimately hers, legitimately in the sense of leaders in Beijing, of course, because they do not have legitimate claims. So they both see the United States as the troublemaker in their regions and worldwide. This is what unites them. But they are still countries that are very suspicious of each other. I mean, Russia should be very concerned by the way China has gained power, whereas Russia is not on an upward path, on an upward trajectory. Russia has become extremely dependent on China, especially after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it depends on China for all sorts of deliveries, semiconductors, for example, that are needed for everything in Moscow. And Russia is not in a position to produce these high technology components on its own. And this imbalance of power between the two, I guess, should really be of concern to Russia, because even in its immediate neighborhood in Central Asia, which Russia has traditionally viewed as its backyard, China is emerging as the partner of choice for many of those countries simply because of the economic prospects and the investment capabilities, etc. Vice versa, China is probably watching very carefully what Russia does, but doesn't want to go down with Russia when Russia is too risk-taking, because the Chinese policy has been more risk-averse than Russia's in the past. This might change down the road, but it has not so far.
And I think obviously a lot of people in China are watching how the West is responding to Russia and Ukraine and thinking about the Taiwan question, although that is something that might end up taking care of itself over time in terms of how that bilateral relationship might develop.
Yeah. Can I add one thought on the differing visions for how the world ought to be structured? Because I think there's a really important difference between the two. So Russia thinks, you can read this in documents and in statements from political leaders in very traditional terms. The ideal is a multipolar world order where each great power sort of presides over its sphere of influence, and the great powers may come together in sort of a global concert and talk things out. Which means Russia always tries to close off what it sees as its sphere of influence. The Chinese policies are very different because they seem to be radiating out and towards China, but they also speak of a multipolar world order. It really is more a Sinocentric world order without separate spheres that are spread out in the world. And I think that's a meaningful difference because at one point it becomes incompatible when the Chinese are, from a Russian standpoint, meddling too much in what they consider their own sphere of influence.
So related to that, one of our viewers is very curious what your views are on China's international role and the recent enlargement of the BRICS as of January of this year, and China's influence in these developing countries and in the global South as a whole.
The interesting thing about China is that they try to revise the international order by focusing on developing nations. So you might have suspected that if you want to change the global order, you focus on the big powers and try to take them on. What the Chinese are doing is they build relationships with developing powers and present themselves as the cheerleader and spearhead for a community of nations that has traditionally been underdeveloped, underempowered in world affairs. And this is a very powerful strategy. And we see that it works out very well in international institutions where countries are embracing Chinese positions, sometimes in really a tit for tat for Chinese investments or investment promises. But it's a very powerful narrative that they are constructing, that the world is changing, that the forgotten half of the world, which is now called the Global South, I try to avoid the term because it's really a political term that is instrumentalized. So Western leaders should stop referring to the Global South as such, because it just plays to those narratives of a world divided between the West and the rest. And the Chinese are very successful in creating these narratives, that the power balance is changing and that China's rise is really not its rise alone, but it will lift up many peoples and countries around the world. And it always comes with an anti-Western sentiment that is catered to very strongly. And so the BRICS format, it's really an interesting mix of countries that is assembled there because they don't share a common worldview whatsoever. The one thing that it might boil down to is an attempt to assert themselves more actively and with more self-confidence in the world vis-a-vis the West. And China tries, I think, to build the BRICS in sort of an anti-Western coalition more than other members of the club do, like India, because India is walking a fine balance between aligning with the United States because they fear China themselves, but still being part of those formats. And the Chinese, I think, are very active in trying to build these formats really into an anti-Western format. I don't want to say alliance because it's far from an alliance, but just an anti-Western club where the identity revolves around up-and-coming states versus the West.
But in light of this, I really think we also have to talk a little bit about global governance at a time of this great power competition. You've talked a little bit about the United Nations and how some of its efforts have been thwarted, but what role do you think international organizations can play in navigating this new order that is emerging?
There is essentially a philosophical divide. Do institutions build so powerful norms and structures that they will keep relations on an even keel, even if countries disagree heavily and have many conflicts with one another? Or are institutions really just the instruments of great powers, but will not, in and by themselves, keep conflict from escalating? And I admit I fall in the second camp. I think institutions have very limited powers to keep strategic rivalries from boiling over and conflicts from escalating, because they are, at the end of the day, still tools that great powers use in their favor. And this is exactly what we are seeing with the People's Republic of China, for example, in the United Nations. So they have mounted a formidable campaign of putting their own diplomats in positions of power in some of the special organizations of the United Nations. They are playing hardball when it comes to redefining human rights through the United Nations system. So they want to see the traditional definition of human rights, which revolves around individual freedom and liberty as is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. They want to move away from that and define human rights as A, the prerogative of sovereign governments to decide, and B, as they want to define human rights as economic development. So this ought to be the prime human right. So China is reshaping the principles that govern the United Nations from within. It's seeking to place its own diplomats in positions of power pursuing really a very vivid campaign of votes diplomacy to have its way. So I'm afraid, I'm very skeptical that the United Nations can pacify and resolve or cool off the strategic competition that we currently see between China and the United States.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of this path forward, if you will, if the United Nations and other multilateral organizations might not be able to do that much, in your book, you propose a new strategy to contain Russia and China and try to preserve prosperity. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, this notion of neo-containment, to sort of stop or at least slow down Moscow's and Beijing's efforts to erode the international order. Can you share with us how you would define this notion of neo-containment and what steps need to be implemented in order to put something like that in place?
So containment obviously was the Cold War strategy that the West used vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And the idea was that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse because of its own internal problems, because of its own internal weaknesses. And all that could be done at the time was to limit the Soviet Union's reach and prevent it from expanding its influence ever further. And that's essentially the idea behind my argument for neo-containment. Both Russia and China have so many internal weaknesses. They are afraid of their own people. They have to rely on massive disinformation campaigns, not only internationally, but also nationally. And this is something that we should be aware of instead of viewing them as so strong and so up and coming as has sometimes been done in Western discourse. Mm-hmm. So they have a lot of flaws internally and a lot of weaknesses. Obviously, we don't live in a world that is divided up in blocks, which was the baseline condition for containment. We live in a networked world, but the alternatives that have been tried and are out there are just not workable. So a policy of engagement has been tried. The idea was to reach out to both, have dialogue, have more interaction, have more trade, and make them liberalize along the way. Obviously, this does not work because they have both resisted liberalization, and essentially engagement has made both stronger and enabled their revisionist policies. Accommodation, so the acceptance of their claims and visions of world order, I think is also not workable. Mm-hmm. Simply because this is not the kind of world order that my country, your country, our community of countries in the West would like to see themselves in. So containment is not a natural policy choice because it goes against the grain of everything that Western policy has been all about in the past 30 years, but I think there is no alternative. And it means limiting their access to technology, to power. So we should really work hard to stop strengthening our antagonists as we have done in previous decades. It would mean putting limits to what they can do for themselves and to others. So if we accept territorial revisionism in one case, it will have a horrible precedent for other cases to come. That's why it's so important to really stand up against Russia in Ukraine, because if the Chinese see that it's easy to get away with land robbery, this would just incentivize an invasion of Taiwan even further. So putting limits to what these countries can do for themselves and to others. That's in short, really the formula that I use for neo-containment. And I know the political hurdles are huge. Mm-hmm. Because we have seen it in dealings with Russia, where things were just forced upon the West with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine from 2022 onward. But with regards to China, where there is no hot conflict, it's even harder to come to terms that this is an adversarial relationship. So in order to get to anything close to a neo-containment policy, we really need clarity of the mindset. That there is really a systemic rivalry out there, and we cannot close our eyes to it, because if we do, we will suffer from it later.
do you feel that we're moving in the right direction in terms of having that clarity and that common view?
Well, yes and no. I want to make the glasses half full argument first, because a lot has changed in the past 2, 3, 4 years. So in dealings with China, it has really been the COVID pandemic that served as an eye-opener at first for many on both sides of the Atlantic, when all of a sudden supply chains broke down, when China closed off, when it was really also for Western businesses close to impossible to go see their investments firsthand in China because it was so hard to travel. And with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022, some of what I call the fog of peace has been lifted. So usually we talk about the fog of war, where things are uncertain in a wartime condition. But with the invasion, it became clear that also China is on the other side. They may not say it openly and publicly, they claim to be neutral, but China is really at Russia's side. And it has become very clear that there is a crucial difference and a crucial conflict line running between both countries and the West. And it has opened the eyes of many, I would say. But in terms of political decision making, we're just not there yet. A lot has happened. We've had strategy documents emerge, even in Germany, our first national security strategy, a China strategy that was at least clear in the sense that there is a challenge out there that we need to deal with. But all the steps that need to be taken going forward, really a lot of work remains to be done.
Well, and so I'm happy that you brought up Germany and sort of the evolution in Germany, because as we start to come to a close, I certainly want to come back to Europe more broadly, but Germany as well, in terms of how Europe is responding to this great power competition that we're seeing. I agree with you completely that it's very important not just to go back 2 years and the start of this phase of the war in Ukraine, but really put where we are today in the broader context of COVID and the disruption that was caused by the pandemic and the lessons that have been learned, maybe not internalized, maybe not applied, but certainly the experiences that we've been through over the last 4 or 5 years that have made us realize that maybe we're not as resilient as we had hoped, and that maybe we need to think a little bit about some of our interdependence with other countries. And so I'd be very curious to hear from you, first maybe how the European response is and how one balances a move for more strategic autonomy, as we're hearing from Paris, with more of a continued dependence on the United States, which is sort of what we're hearing more of from Warsaw, and Germany, not just geographically being in the middle, but also in its sort of political stance, being somewhat in the middle between France and Poland.
So you put a lot in that question. Let me take
I know. And you can respond however you want. There's a lot there.
Yeah, let me maybe address the strategic autonomy question first. You're absolutely right. There is no agreement whatsoever about the term, what it should mean, and how Europe should position itself vis-a-vis the United States. I was frankly glad to see that since the invasion of Ukraine, this talk about strategic autonomy has gone away somewhat, because even those in Paris realized that Europe is far from capable of deterring Russia, dealing with security problems, even in its immediate neighborhood by itself. But with the prospect of a renewed Trump presidency that we're observing here on this side of the Atlantic, the talk about strategic autonomy returns. I think it's a totally flawed concept, because it implies as if our biggest concern and the biggest challenge that we had was the United States, and our biggest priority should be how we distance ourselves to become more strategically autonomous. This is a totally flawed reading of events, because in most of the times, Europe and the United States will be at one another's side, because we are each other's closest partners. And the challenges that we see in the world, be it a violent Russia, be it a revisionist China, be it an aggressive Iran, they concern both of us alike. So I wish we would stop talking about strategic autonomy and just focus on making Europe more resilient and more capable as a partner to the United States at eye level. And we are far from there yet. So I'm all for more European capabilities, strengthening the European pillar of NATO. But if I could advise policymakers, I would really advise them to stop talking about strategic autonomy, because it divides Europe, as you mentioned. The Poles, the Balts, they don't want to hear anything about strategic autonomy if it means loosening ties from the United States, because they do not believe in EU Brussels to take care of their security. And I understand why. The EU is just too weak to do that. Now, the second part of your question was about how Germany, how others have adapted to the war in Ukraine. Would you like me to address that now, or would you like to ask another question in between?
I think that would be great.
So again, there's been a steep learning curve, and I would like to give credit to all of the governments for really stepping forward, stepping up, investing in their own defense to a degree that we have not seen before. So more has changed in the past 2 years, also in German foreign and security policy, than in the entire decade before. But still, isn't it awkward that we have to applaud this when a hot war is raging not too far from our borders? So it should be self-evident that you're investing in your own defense and that you're pursuing a more realistic security policy. And we are really not there yet, because if I may take up the German debate, whenever we talk about support for Ukraine, it's really half-hearted what we've been doing in the past 2 years, because debates have been going on for months and months about each individual weapon system. Eventually, the answer was yes, but it always took months to decide it. And time is really a crucial factor in that war. Ukraine does not have time forever. And putting up a defense, it really, you have to get these supplies, you have to get ammunition in a timely manner. And Europe has been too slow to be forthcoming on that front. So the United States still is a crucial partner. And with Ukraine aid stalling in Congress, this is really bad news for European security and for Ukraine. That being said, just one last sentence. Europe has been a key partner in the financial and economic and humanitarian realm. And I don't want to let this fall under the table, because it's equally important. Ukraine needs that kind of assistance as well, because otherwise the Ukrainian state cannot survive in its defensive operations. But to fight a war, you really need military equipment to be able to defend yourself. So more has to be done on that front.
So let's maybe in the last few minutes that we have really come back to Germany specifically. And you've talked a little bit about Germany. You've talked about the impact of the Zeitenwende and sort of the real shift in German defense and security policy over the last couple of years. Earlier in our conversation, you also touched on the fact that Germany now has a national security strategy and just released a China strategy as well, both within the last 12 months, having been released in the second half of last year. And I guess the closing question that I would have for you is sort of where Germany sees its place in this emerging international order, and how it is trying to respond to today's systemic rivalry and strategic competition.
I'm afraid I cannot give you a clear-cut answer, because we get competing signals. So if you look at public opinion, the need for a new approach to the world, it has not sunk in yet. So the German public still prefers a sort of laid-back position, take less of a role in terms of the defense of Europe, less of a military role. If you have the choice between keeping out of international problems or getting yourself involved in international problems, the German public is still calling for less international involvement in terms of political role, conflict management, etc. So there is still a hesitancy in the German public to come to grips with this new reality. And I think it has to do with the way political leaders have been communicating or non-communicating about this new world that we're in. The Chancellor has sent really differing signals. So he published an article in Foreign Affairs that many of our viewers may have read too, where he suggests that a new Cold War-like situation was not inevitable, that it's really a matter of choice and will, whether we end up in that sort of conflictive status or not. And this may be more hope than a realistic assessment of where we live in, the world we live in, because the idea that we are moving towards a multipolar order that offers chances is, I think, an over-optimistic one, but it's played again and again by our Chancellor. When you listen to the foreign minister or the defense minister, they strike a very different tone. So they speak very forcefully about the need to become more defensive, more resilient, et cetera, and that there is a conflict with Russia, also with China, that needs to be taken on when you look at what the foreign minister, for example, has said. So there is a conflict within the governing coalition that suggests that we have competing views about where the world is headed and what Germany's role is in it. And the least common denominator that you will get is that Germany needs to take more responsibility. But what that means in practice really is up for grabs. So it's not clearly spoken out what it would mean for Germany's foreign policy. You have the idea of a leadership role, even in the military realm, but our capabilities are far from it. And as I mentioned, the public is not ready or is not being prepared for it, because you would need a very clear messaging from political leaders in Berlin.
And then there's also the economic or business dimension, right? I mean, we were talking earlier in our conversation about why some of the signs might have been missed in the late 90s and early aughts, and part of it was business interests in countries like Russia and China. Certainly when Germany's new China policy was released, this was very much sort of the viewpoint of political Berlin, but not necessarily reflecting the viewpoint of German businesses, which also have interests in China. Where do you see German business sort of fitting into this conversation right now?
So what I hear from the business community is really that they're struggling with the degree of uncertainty that is out there, both because of international developments, but also in terms of political decisions and how they might impact business opportunities going forward. The view of China has soured very distinctly, and you can read up on this in some of the communications from the industrial lobby, etc. So the idea that China is all about opportunity and growth, well, not anymore. People see the downsides of it. But then again, China is still such an important market for key sectors of the industry, the automobile industry first and foremost, that they really cannot just disengage and leave the market. So there are competing pressures and constraints that are really not easily reconciled. So I guess the one term that I would use to describe the mood as I see it and I hear it from the business community is really uncertainty and risk that is out there.
So as we come to a close, let me just ask maybe one final question about your book. And let me remind our viewers that the title of the book is Russia, China, and the Revisionist Assault on the Western Liberal International Order. The closing question to you is why did you write this book? And the second part is, what has the response been to this book over the last couple of months?
So I started writing this book in 2015, way ahead of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And back at the time when I wrote the book and it became obvious what my findings would be, the sentiment here in the country was still, oh, let's not worry too much. Things will somehow magically turn out right. So the idea that we're encountering new geopolitical and geoeconomic struggles was really very absent from the public discourse, but also from academic discourses, because as you may know, international relations here is very much looking at institutions, global governance, peace and conflict research, but we don't have many chairs focused on security policy or geopolitics or geoeconomics. So these themes are underrepresented in German academia. So I thought there was a void that needed to be filled, because I saw these developments as really the most dangerous ones for the world at large. Other conflicts, local, regional conflicts, do play meaningful roles, but this basic conflict line between Russia, China, and the West is really one that is affecting the entire globe. And that's why I was writing the book, to fill a void that I viewed, and because I thought it's also politically relevant to look into these two powers and their policies more carefully. Now, it came out in 2023, and the attitude, the mood has changed here in the country. So there's a lot of interest in my work, and just in the idea of great power competition between Russia, China, and the West, which is unfortunate for the world that we live in. But I have received a lot of interest now for the book, as it was published last year.
Well, Gerlinde, herzlichen Dank. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with us. Also on behalf of Christian Forstner and the Hanns-Seidel-Stiftung, we really appreciate this conversation. This is obviously going to be a topic that we are going to be dealing with for years to come. And so we look forward to continuing to engage in an exchange with you about great power competition and the international order. But for now, many, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Christian. Thanks for having me.